If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The mansion on the Upper East Side had always been too grand for just one man. Michael Thompson walked through the silent corridors of the house that had once been filled with life, voices and laughter, but now felt like a mausoleum of marble and glass. The heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, creating a perpetual twilight that perfectly matched its owner's state of mind. At 42, Michael carried on his shoulders the weight of a business empire built through sacrifice and the bitterness of losses that no amount of money could ever repair. It had been almost 3 years since Patricia was gone. 3 years since that accident on the FDR Drive turned his life into a never-ending nightmare. 3 years since he decided the world outside was too dangerous, too treacherous, too unpredictable. The house became his refuge and his prison. He managed his businesses remotely, attended meetings via video conference, and signed contracts digitally. He avoided direct human contact as much as possible, convinced that every person who got close had some hidden agenda. This distrust hadn't been born solely from losing Patricia. Over the years, Michael had learned the hard way that money attracts not only opportunities, but also opportunists, partners who embezzled funds, friends who asked for loans and then vanished, employees who stole insider information, and worse, people who faked friendship just to get access to his resources. Each disappointment built another layer of armor around his heart until it became virtually impenetrable. Michael's son, Leo, lived with his ex-wife in a gated community in Tribeca. The divorce had been amicable, even civilized, but distant. Claire, his ex-wife, had moved on with a tech entrepreneur, and Leo, now 8 years old, visited his father only on alternate weekends, always accompanied by the nanny Claire had hired. Michael knew he was failing as a father. He knew his presence was mechanical, distant, formal, but he couldn't allow himself to show affection when everything around him felt temporary and potentially dangerous. It was Claire who suggested he hire someone to help with Leo during his visits, someone who understood children's routines, who could give the boy her full attention, while Michael dealt with his professional commitments. At first, he resisted. The idea of having another person moving through his house, with access to his spaces, his privacy, was unsettling. But Claire was firm. Leo needed structure, someone to support him emotionally, since his father seemed incapable of doing so. That's how Michael contacted the Sterling Agency, a company specializing in childcare for high-net-worth families in New York. The agency's owner, Mrs. Davis, was a 60-year-old woman with 40 years of experience in the field. She conducted the interview with Michael herself, listening attentively to his strict requirements. He wanted someone experienced, discreet, with impeccable references, and above all, someone who wouldn't ask unnecessary questions about his personal life. Mrs. Davis thought for a few moments and then mentioned Helen Carter, a 32-year-old professional with a degree in education and a specialization in inclusive early childhood education. She had worked in private schools and for private families and had one notable characteristic: she never got emotionally involved beyond what was necessary. She was polite, efficient, but maintained a respectful distance, exactly what Michael was looking for. There was just one detail. Helen had a young daughter, Isabella, who was 5, and needed to accompany her to work. Michael hesitated. The idea of having another child running around the house was not part of his plan. But Mrs. Davis was persuasive. Isabella was a quiet girl who wasn't any trouble and could even be interesting company for Leo. Besides, Helen would never accept a job that separated her from her daughter for long periods. It was a package deal. Reluctantly, Michael agreed to at least meet them. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Michael waited in his office, sitting behind the large rosewood desk that had belonged to his grandfather. The room was imposing, with shelves full of books on corporate, law and economics, abstract paintings on the walls, and a prime view of the inner garden. He watched through the window as a cab pulled up to the gate. A woman of average height, with brown hair tied in a neat bun, got out, holding the hand of a little girl with delicate features. Helen wore black dress pants, a white blouse, and a well-tailored grey blazer. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, She looked like someone who understood the importance of discretion. Isabella wore a simple, light blue cotton dress and white sneakers. Her large, observant eyes took in everything around, her with a restrained curiosity. Michael noticed the girl didn't let go of her mother's hand, a gesture that suggested dependence or insecurity. When Helen entered the office, her posture was serene but not submissive. She greeted Michael with a firm handshake, looking him directly in the eye without wavering. Isabella stood by her side, quiet, observing the man before her with an expression that was hard to read. Michael conducted the interview as if it were a business meeting. He asked about her previous experience, her academic background, and how she would handle specific situations involving children. Helen answered, each question with clarity and objectivity. She didn't elaborate with unnecessary details, didn't try to create forced empathy with personal stories, and didn't ask invasive questions about Michael's life. She simply answered what was asked and waited for the next question. When Michael mentioned that Leo had moments of irritability and difficulty accepting boundaries, Helen just nodded and said she would work with patience and consistency, establishing clear routines. When he asked about Isabella, if the girl would be any trouble, Helen calmly explained that her daughter had specific communication needs and followed a structured routine with therapeutic activities. She didn't go into medical details or ask for sympathy. She just stated that the girl would be well cared for and wouldn't interfere with her work. Michael noticed something about this woman that intrigued him. She didn't have the common desperation of someone who urgently needed a job. There was none of the typical flattery of someone standing before a rich and powerful man. Helen seemed to be assessing the situation just as much as he was assessing her. It was as if she too was deciding whether this environment would be suitable for her and her daughter. This attitude, curiously, pleased Michael. Desperate people were unpredictable. Desperate people would do anything for money. At the end of the interview, Michael informed her that he would give her an answer within 24 hours. Helen thanked him, picked up her bag and Isabella's hand, and left the office with the same discretion she had shown upon entering. Michael was left alone, watching through the window as they got back into the cab. Something about that scene bothered him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was Helen's excessive calm, maybe it was the girl's absolute silence, or maybe it was just his own chronic suspicion trying to find problems where there were none. That night, Michael called Mrs. Davis and requested a full background report on Helen Carter. He wanted to know everything. Detailed professional history, references from previous employers, financial situation if possible. Mrs. Davis, accustomed to demanding clients, wasn't surprised. She promised to email everything by the end of the next day. The report arrived as promised. Helen had an impeccable record. She had worked for 5 years at an elite private school in Scarsdale, where she was beloved by parents and children alike. She had left only because she needed a more flexible schedule due to Isabella's needs. Afterward, she worked for 2 families, both with extremely positive recommendations. Her employers praised her ethics, her discretion, and her competence. Financially, she seemed stable within her means. No exorbitant debts, no lawsuits, nothing that raised any red flags. Michael read and reread the report. He looked for loopholes, inconsistencies, anything to justify his reluctance. He found nothing. Still, the suspicion lingered. It was always like this. He didn't trust perfection. Perfection was suspicious, but he had to make a decision. Leo was coming for the weekend, and Claire was already pressing him for an answer. On Friday afternoon, Michael called Mrs. Davis and confirmed the hire. Helen could start the following Saturday. The salary would be generous, in line with the family's standard. She would have a room available in the staff wing if she needed to stay overnight, and meals would be included. Mrs. Davis was pleased and promised to pass on the information immediately. When Saturday arrived, Michael woke up earlier than usual. There was a strange anxiety in the air, a feeling that something was about to change, though he didn't know exactly what. He had his coffee alone in the kitchen, as usual, while watching the garden through the large window. The house was too quiet. It always was, but on that day, the silence seemed even more oppressive. Helen arrived promptly at 8 in the morning. Michael watched on the security camera as she and Isabella came through the gate. They both carried small backpacks. Isabella clutched a worn-out teddy bear, holding it tightly against her chest. Eunice, the housekeeper who had worked in the house for over 15 years, greeted them at the door and led them to their room. To a simple but comfortable space on the ground floor, near the service area. Michael didn't go down to greet them. He remained in his office, watching everything from a distance through the cameras strategically placed around the house. It wasn't paranoia, he told himself. It was just caution. Helen didn't know she was being watched. No one did. The cameras were discreet, embedded in light fixtures and decorative objects. He could see almost every room in the house, except for the bedrooms and bathrooms, of course. Even his suspicion had its limits. Leo arrived around 10 o'clock. The boy ran. Through the door, making the characteristic noise of an energetic child. Eunice welcomed him with a warm smile and told him there was a surprise waiting for him. Curious, Leo followed the housekeeper to the living room, where Helen and Isabella were waiting. From his office, Michael watched everything. He saw Helen crouch down to be at Leo's level and introduce herself with a discreet but genuine smile. He saw Isabella, shy, hide behind her mother, just watching. He saw Helen explain to the boy that they would be there to keep him company and that they could play together, if he wanted. Leo, always wary of strangers like his father, just nodded and asked if they liked video games. The interaction was natural, without forcing intimacy. Helen didn't try to win Leo over with exaggerated promises or artificial enthusiasm. She simply made herself available, respecting the boy's time and space. Isabella remained quiet, hugging her teddy bear, but her attentive eyes didn't miss a single movement around her. The next few hours were spent in observation. Michael stayed in his office, dividing his attention between the financial reports on his computer screen and the images from the security cameras. Helen led Leo and Isabella to the garden, where she set up a small activity station with paper, colored pencils, and Play-Doh. Isabella participated in her own way, creating simple, methodical shapes. Leo, more restless, soon tired of the crafts and asked to kick a ball around. Helen didn't hesitate. She took off her blazer, leaving just her white blouse, and started playing with Leo. She wasn't a pro soccer player, but she made a genuine effort, running after the ball and celebrating the boys' goals as if they were major achievements. Isabella watched from a distance, sitting on the grass, manipulating small objects she had brought in her backpack. Every now and then, Helen would glance back to check on her daughter, but without interrupting the game with Leo. Michael noticed that Helen had an impressive sense of balance. She divided her attention between the two children without neglecting either of them. When Leo needed a boundary set, she did it firmly, but without aggression. When Isabella showed any sensory discomfort, Helen immediately adjusted the environment, lowering the volume of the music playing in the garden or offering a different tactile toy. At lunchtime, Eunice served the meal in the dining room. Michael only came down to get his plate and went back up, claiming he had urgent work. In reality, he wanted to keep watching. Helen sat at the table with the children, helping Leo serve himself and preparing Isabella's plate with foods the girl would eat. There was no drama, no conflict, just a quiet meal with light conversation about cartoons and games. After lunch, Helen organized some quiet time. Leo went to his room to play video games, while Isabella lay down on the living room sofa with her teddy bear. Helen took the opportunity to tidy up the toys that had been scattered around the garden, putting everything back in its proper place. She left no trace of mess. Everything was done with method and attention to detail. In the mid-afternoon, when Leo asked for a snack, Helen went to the kitchen and prepared sandwiches with ingredients Eunice had made available. She cut up fruit, made fresh squeezed juice, and arranged everything neatly on a tray. She served the children on the patio and then sat with them, eating her own snack in silence. There was no rush, no anxiety, just a serene and attentive presence. Michael realized that Helen didn't ask questions about the house, about him, or about the family's routine. She simply adapted to the environment and did her job. She didn't try to strike up conversations with Eunice beyond what was necessary. She didn't explore rooms that were of no concern to her. When she needed something, she asked politely and thanked them simply. The afternoon ended quickly. Claire came to pick up Leo around 6 o'clock. The boy was visibly calmer and more content than usual. When Claire asked how his day had been, he simply said it was cool and that Helen let him do cool things. Claire looked at Helen with an approving smile and thanked her for her care. Helen just returned the smile and said it was a pleasure. When the house fell silent again, Helen collected Isabella, who was already showing signs of tiredness, and took the girl to their room. Eunice commented to Michael, who had finally come down to the kitchen, that Helen seemed to be an excellent professional. Michael just nodded in agreement, but inside, the suspicion still throbbed. It was too early to draw conclusions. People always behaved well at the beginning. True character emerged over time, with familiarity, with opportunity. That night before going to sleep, Michael reviewed all the day's recordings again. He watched specific moments in slow motion, looking for any suspicious gesture, any furtive glance, any behavior that might indicate ulterior motives. He found nothing, absolutely nothing, and that in a way made him even more alert, because in Michael Thompson's experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was, a carefully constructed illusion. He closed his laptop, turned off the office light, and walked to his bedroom. The mansion was plunged into darkness, lit only by the garden posts that cast long shadows on the walls. As he passed through the hallway, Michael heard a low sound coming from Helen's room. It was a lullaby, sung in a soft voice, almost a whisper. He stopped for a moment, just listening. There was something in that melody that touched a dormant part of his soul, a part he preferred to keep locked away. He shook his head, pushing the feeling away, and continued to his room. The following weeks established a routine. Helen arrived every Saturday and Sunday when Leo was at the house. Sometimes she stayed late. Sometimes she stayed overnight, depending on the need. Michael continued to watch from a distance, attentive to every move, but so far he had found no concrete reason to be suspicious. Helen was punctual, efficient, discreet. Isabella remained quiet, always close to her mother, but was slowly starting to explore more of the house's spaces. Leo, for his part, was visibly happier. He eagerly awaited the weekends, not just to see his father, but also to see Helen and Isabella. The girl, despite her silence, had a curious influence on Leo. He became more patient, more careful, as if he instinctively understood that he needed to adapt to her different rhythm. They played together in unusual ways, assembling puzzles in silence, drawing side by side, building block towers with extreme concentration. Michael observed all of this with conflicting feelings. On one hand, he was happy to see his son calmer and more engaged. On the other, he felt a growing unease with Helen's presence, not because she did anything wrong. Quite the opposite. It was the absence of mistakes that disturbed him. No one was that perfect. No one maintained such an impeccable demeanor all the time. There had to be a flaw, a crack, a moment of carelessness that would reveal her true nature. But for now, nothing. Just silent competence and a presence that was slowly beginning to fill the empty spaces of that mansion. And that, for Michael Thompson, was more threatening than any obvious betrayal. A month had passed since Helen's arrival. The weekend routine was established and running like a well-oiled machine. Leo eagerly awaited the visits, no longer just to see his father, but to reunite with the quiet duo that occupied a growing space in his thoughts. Isabella remained a discreet presence, but her influence on the boy was undeniable. He had learned to interpret her gestures, to respect her silence, to celebrate her small victories when she managed to express something new. Michael, meanwhile, maintained his constant vigilance. He reviewed the recordings religiously every night, like a detective searching for clues to a crime that hadn't yet been committed. Helen remained flawless, punctual, professional, discreet. She didn't ask questions about his life, showed no curiosity about the expensive objects scattered around the house, and didn't try to initiate intimate conversations with Eunice or anyone else. It was as if she had created a protective bubble around herself, allowing her to do her job without getting emotionally involved with anything beyond the children. It was on a rainy Thursday in March that Ryan Thompson showed up. Michael was in his office reviewing contracts when he heard the doorbell. He wasn't expecting visitors. He rarely did. Through the cameras he saw Eunice answer the door and Ryan walk in with that wide smile that never reached his eyes. His second cousin was a 37-year-old man, always well-dressed in an impeccable Italian suit jacket and polished leather shoes. He worked as a lawyer, but his earnings never seemed to justify the lifestyle he flaunted. Ryan and Michael had a complex relationship. They were family, shared the same last name, but little else. After Patricia's death, Ryan had become a constant presence, offering help with documents, legal matters, and the administration of some businesses. Michael, lost in grief and seclusion, had accepted this help without much question. Ryan had power of attorney to sign some documents on his behalf, manage some of the company-related paperwork, and facilitated bureaucratic processes that Michael had no patience for. Michael went down to greet him. Ryan was already comfortably settled in the living room, flipping through an architecture magazine on the coffee table. "Cousin, what a nice surprise," Michael said, with little enthusiasm in his voice. Ryan stood up and shook Michael's hand with excessive vigor. "Michael, my friend, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by. It's been a while since we've talked in person. How are you?" Michael made a vague gesture with his hand. "Same as always. Working, taking care of things." Ryan nodded with exaggerated understanding. "I get it, man, I get it. Life hasn't been easy for you. But it's important to keep in touch with family, you know? We can't completely isolate ourselves." They made small talk for a few minutes. Ryan commented on some cases he was handling, mentioned meetings with lawyers and accountants, and talked about investments and business opportunities. Michael listened with moderate attention, responding with monosyllables when necessary. There was something about Ryan's presence that always made him slightly uncomfortable, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. It was when Eunice passed through the room with a tray of juice that Ryan asked a little too casually if there was someone new working in the house. Michael briefly explained about Helen, about her role on weekends when Leo visited. Ryan raised his eyebrows with interest. "Oh, hired a new nanny. Is she trustworthy?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Michael frowned. "She was recommended by a reputable agency. She has good references." Ryan smiled, but there was something calculated in it. Of course. I'm not doubting you, man. But you know how it is, right? People who work in houses like yours always have access to a lot. Information, valuables, important documents. You have to be careful." Michael felt a pang of irritation. "I'm always careful, Ryan. I don't need you to remind me." Ryan held up his hands in a gesture of peace. I know. You've always been careful. It's just that you know how it is, cousin. We live in a country with huge inequality. Simple people sometimes see an opportunity and can't resist. I'm not saying this nanny is dishonest. I'm just saying it's good to keep an eye out. Sometimes the ones who seem the most proper are the ones who know how to hide the best." Ryan's words echoed in Michael's mind long after his cousin had left. A seed of doubt had been planted, small but persistent. Michael went back to his office and reviewed the recordings from the past few days again. He looked for something he might have missed before. A prolonged glance at a valuable object, a detour through the hallways, anything. He found nothing. Helen continued to follow the exact same pattern. She cared for the children, maintained order, and respected the boundaries of the spaces. But Ryan's words had stirred something deep within Michael. What if he was being naive? What if all that discreet competence was just a carefully constructed facade? What if Helen was just waiting for the right moment, slowly gaining his trust to then make her move? That night, Michael had trouble sleeping. He tossed and turned in bed, staring at the dark ceiling as disjointed thoughts flooded his mind. He remembered Patricia, how easily she trusted people. He remembered how that trust had cost them dearly a few times. He remembered employees who stole, friends who betrayed, partners who lied. The world was full of masks. Everyone wore one. When he finally fell asleep, Michael had a disturbing dream. He was walking through the mansion's corridors, searching for something he couldn't identify. The doors opened on their own as he passed, revealing empty, silent rooms. Suddenly, he found himself in the office. The safe was wide open, completely empty. He turned and saw Patricia standing in the doorway, looking at him with a sad expression. She said nothing, just pointed at the empty safe and disappeared. Michael woke up sweating, his heart racing. It was 4 a.m. He got up, went to the kitchen, and drank a glass of water. The dream had been so vivid, so real. The open safe, Patricia pointing. What did it mean? Was it a warning, a premonition, or just his paranoid mind creating impossible scenarios? He went back to the office and stared at the safe built into the wall, behind a painting by a Brazilian artist. Inside was cash, jewelry that had belonged to Patricia, and important documents. Everything was locked, secure. But the image from the dream wouldn't leave his head. What if he tested Helen? What if he created a situation where she would have access to something valuable and observed how she reacted? Wouldn't that be the definitive answer he was looking for? The idea began to take shape. Michael spent the next few days mentally crafting a plan. It couldn't be too obvious. Helen was smart. She noticed details. It had to look like a genuine oversight, an unexpected opportunity. And he needed to be absolutely sure of what he was doing, because if she passed the test, he would have to admit he was wrong. And Michael Thompson rarely admitted he was wrong. Saturday arrived again. Helen and Isabella showed up promptly at 8 a.m. Michael watched their arrival from his office window. Helen wore jeans, a light-colored blouse, and a beige cardigan. Isabella was in a floral dress with her inseparable teddy bear under her arm. They looked so normal, so genuine. Could it all be an act? Leo arrived shortly after. The day's routine proceeded as usual. Games in the garden, a quiet lunch, an afternoon of activities. Michael participated more than usual, coming down to have lunch with everyone in the dining room. Helen seemed slightly surprised by his presence, but showed no discomfort. They talked briefly about how Leo was developing, about Isabella's small progress in her therapies. Helen spoke about her daughter with a mix of realism and hope, without dramatizing the difficulties or minimizing the challenges. During the conversation, Michael watched her hands. They were well kept, but showed signs of work. Short nails, no polish, no jewelry other than a simple wristwatch, no rings, no necklace, no flashy earrings. Everything about her was restrained, discreet, almost austere. It was either genuine simplicity or a very well-thought-out strategy. In the afternoon, while the children were engrossed in a movie in the media room, Helen excused herself to use the restroom. Michael seized the moment. He went quickly up to the office, opened the safe, and left it wide open. Cash, about $15,000. Patricia's jewelry, including a diamond necklace valued at over $50,000. Important documents, including property deeds. All in plain sight, as if he had forgotten to close it after taking something out. Michael installed additional cameras at strategic angles in the office, ensuring they would capture every movement, every expression. Then he left the room, leaving the door ajar. He went down to the garage where he watched everything on his phone connected to the camera system. His heart was pounding. This was the moment of truth. Helen returned from the restroom and went to the media room to check on the children. They were still watching the movie, absorbed in the screen. Isabella was lying on the sofa, hugging her teddy bear. Leo was eating popcorn from a large bowl. All was quiet. Helen then went upstairs, carrying a laundry basket that needed to be put away in Leo's closet. Michael followed her every move on his phone's cameras. She entered Leo's room, carefully organized the clothes in the closet. Then she left and walked down the hall. She passed by the office and stopped. She looked at the ajar door. She hesitated for a moment. Then, slowly, she pushed the door open and went inside. Michael held his breath. The cameras showed Helen standing at the entrance of the office, observing the room. Her gaze swept across the space until it landed on the open safe. She frowned, clearly surprised. She approached slowly, as if trying to understand what she was seeing. She stopped in front of the safe and looked at the contents without touching anything. For almost a full minute, Helen just stood there, looking. Michael zoomed in on the image on his phone, trying to decipher her expression. She seemed confused, perhaps worried. There was no greed in her eyes, None of that characteristic glint he had seen so many times when people encountered significant sums of money. There was only concern. Helen then did something Michael didn't expect. She stepped away from the safe, went to the office desk and picked up a piece of paper and a pen. She sat down and began to write. Michael couldn't see exactly what she was writing, but he could see the concentration on her face. She wrote for a few minutes, then reread what she had written, nodded to herself, and left the paper on the desk in plain sight. Without touching a single thing in the safe, Helen left the office and went downstairs. She returned to the children as if nothing had happened. Michael waited a few more minutes before leaving the garage. He went straight up to the office, his heart still racing. He went to the desk and picked up the note Helen had left. The handwriting was clear, neat. The message, direct. Mr. Thompson, when I went upstairs to put clothes away in Leo's room, I found the office door ajar and the safe open. I came in to check if everything was all right. I did not touch anything. By my visual count, there is approximately $15,000 in cash, a jewelry box, and some envelopes that appear to be important documents. Please verify that everything is correct. If you need me to be present for the verification, I am at your disposal. Helen. Michael read and reread the note several times. He sat down in his chair, still holding the paper, trying to process what had just happened. She hadn't touched anything, she hadn't taken a single cent. Instead, she had documented everything and left a warning. It was the exact opposite of what Ryan had insinuated. It was the opposite of what he himself had expected to find. But suspicion was a hard habit to break. Michael considered all the possibilities. Maybe Helen knew about the cameras. Maybe she was just being cautious because she knew she was being watched. Maybe it was a long-term strategy, building trust for a bigger score in the future. Or maybe, just maybe, she was genuinely honest. He put everything back in the safe, locked it carefully, and went downstairs. The rest of the day proceeded normally. Helen didn't mention the incident. She didn't approach Michael to ask about the safe. She showed no expectation of acknowledgement. She just continued to care for the children, organize activities, and maintain the routine. When Claire arrived to pick up Leo in the late afternoon, the boy was beaming. He excitedly told her about the movie he watched, the games with Isabella, and the new game Helen had taught him. Claire thanked Helen once again for her work and commented on how Leo seemed more mature, more responsible. Helen just smiled politely and said the boy was special. After everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Michael was alone in his office. He looked at Helen's note, still on the desk. The words were simple, direct, unadorned. There was no attempt at emotional manipulation, no drama, no expectation of gratitude, just an objective report of the facts. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt something he couldn't name. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close to a doubt about his own doubt, and that scared him more than any confirmation of his suspicions ever could. In the following weeks, Michael devised new, more subtle tests. He would leave extra money when he asked Helen to buy something for Leo. He watched how she separated the change, always detailed, always accompanied by receipts. He left important documents scattered on his desk. She would just organize them into neat piles without reading them. He created situations where she could easily take something of value without being noticed. She never did. With each test she passed, Michael's confusion grew. Because if Helen was genuinely honest, it meant he was being unfair, and Michael didn't like to be unfair, but he also couldn't just accept it and trust her. The scar of his distrust was too deep. It was during this period that Michael began to notice something beyond the tests. He started to see small details about Helen and Isabella that had previously gone unnoticed. He noticed how Helen woke up early every Saturday and prepared breakfast for her daughter with extreme care, selecting specific foods that Isabella would eat. He noticed how she always carried a bag with therapeutic materials, sensory toys, and objects that helped the girl regulate her emotions. He discovered, through a casual conversation with Eunice, that Helen paid for Isabella's specialized therapies out of her own pocket, that she saved every penny to ensure her daughter had access to the best professionals, that she often went without things for herself to invest in her daughter's treatment. None of this was said with the intention of arousing pity. Eunice had found out by chance, seeing medical bills that had fallen out of Helen's bag. Michael grew thoughtful. Here was a woman who was clearly struggling financially, who had every reason in the world to take an easy opportunity to improve her situation, but who consistently chose honesty, not out of fear of being caught, not as a strategy, but apparently out of principle. One night, after another weekend of observation, Michael was in his office when he heard footsteps in the hall. It was late, almost midnight. Helen and Isabella should have been asleep. He opened the door and saw Helen walking toward the kitchen, carrying Isabella in her arms. The girl seemed agitated, bothered by something. Helen was startled to see Michael. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. I didn't mean to disturb you. Isabella has a bit of an earache. I'm going to make a warm compress for her." Michael just nodded and went back to his office. But he listened. He heard Helen in the kitchen carefully preparing the compress. He heard her soft voice talking to her daughter, calming her. He heard the lullaby she sang, the same one he had heard before. There was something in that scene, in that mother's quiet dedication to her daughter in the middle of the night, that touched something inside him. He got up and went to the kitchen. Helen was sitting with Isabella in her lap, applying the warm compress to the girl's ear. When she saw Michael, she started to get up, but he gestured for her to stay seated. "Will she be okay?" Michael asked, surprising himself with the genuine concern in his voice. Helen nodded. "It's just a sensitivity she has. With the compress and the medicine I gave her, it should pass soon. I'm sorry if we made any noise." Michael shook his head. "You didn't make any noise. I was still awake." He hesitated for a moment, then asked something that had been on his mind for weeks. "Helen, why didn't you take anything from that safe?" Helen looked at him with those serene eyes and answered with disarming simplicity. "Because it wasn't mine, Mr. Thompson, and because that's not why I'm here. I came here to take care of children, to earn my salary honestly, to protect my daughter and give her a decent life. But you must have your financial struggles. Anyone in your situation would be tempted." Helen smiled sadly. "Everyone has struggles, Mr. Thompson. But stealing doesn't solve anything. It only creates bigger problems. My mother always said that dignity isn't for sale and honesty isn't negotiable. I may not have much, but I have a clear conscience, and that's worth more than any money." Michael stood in silence, processing her words. There was a strength in that woman he hadn't noticed before. Not the strength of aggression or ambition. It was the strength of integrity, of consistency, of someone who knew her values and wouldn't betray them for anything. Isabella began to relax, her discomfort easing with the compress. Helen continued to hum softly until the girl fell asleep in her arms. Michael watched the scene, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. It had been so long since he had seen genuine love, unconditional care, true devotion. Everything in his life had become transactional, but here in this quiet kitchen was something pure. Helen stood up carefully, holding Isabella. "I'll take her to her room. Good night, Mr. Thompson." "Good night, Helen, and thank you." She looked confused. "For what, sir?" "For showing me that there are still good people in this world." Helen just smiled and left the kitchen, carrying her sleeping daughter. Michael stood there for long minutes, looking at the empty space where they had been. Something inside him was changing, cracking, rearranging itself, and it was both liberating and terrifying. The following months brought subtle but significant changes to the mansion's dynamic. Michael began to participate more in the weekend activities, not in an invasive or forced way, but with a more genuine presence. He would sit in the garden while the children played, sometimes even joining them in simple games. Leo noticed the difference and, little by little, began to seek out his father more, not just out of obligation, but out of his own desire. Helen maintained her professional demeanor, but there was a new lightness in her interactions with Michael. She was no longer intimidated by his presence, no longer measured her words so carefully. They talked about simple things, the children's development, recipes, neighborhood news. Nothing deep, nothing intimate. But a bridge was being built, brick by brick. Isabella was changing too. The girl who had arrived months ago, always clinging to her teddy bear and avoiding eye contact, now explored more of the house's spaces. She still had her quirks, her specific needs, but she showed more confidence. One day, to everyone's surprise, she spontaneously approached Michael and handed him a drawing. It was a colorful house with several figures inside. Michael didn't know how to interpret children's art, but Helen explained that for Isabella, drawing people inside a house meant feeling safe in that environment. Michael kept that drawing in his office drawer. He didn't tell anyone, but that simple gesture from a child who barely spoke had touched something deep in his hardened heart. It was mid-June when Ryan showed up again. There was an unusual chill for New York, and rain fell persistently against the mansion's windows. Michael was in his office when Eunice announced his cousin's visit. He went down to meet him in the living room, where Ryan was waiting with a brown envelope in his hands and that serious expression he used when he wanted to seem important. "Michael, we need to talk," Ryan said without preamble. "It's about some investments we made in your name. I need you to sign some documents." Michael took the envelope and quickly flipped through the papers inside. They were dense contracts, full of legal jargon. Normally, he would just sign whatever Ryan brought, trusting his cousin's legal expertise. But something that day made him hesitate. Maybe it was the conversation with Helen about honesty. Maybe it was a delayed intuition. Or maybe it was just the fact that he was starting to question things he had previously accepted without a thought. "Let me take a closer look at these," Michael said, putting the envelope aside. "I'll stop by your office next week." Ryan frowned. "Michael, it's important to sign these soon. There are deadlines." "If there are deadlines, you should have brought them sooner, don't you think?" Michael replied, with a new coldness in his voice. "A week won't make a difference." Ryan looked like he was about to argue but held back. He forced a smile and agreed. "Of course, cousin. Whatever you prefer." He hesitated, then asked a little too casually, "Is that Nanny still working here?" "She is. Why?" "Just curious. She seems very dedicated. Almost too dedicated, don't you think? People like that sometimes have ulterior motives." Michael felt a rising irritation. "Helen is an excellent professional. I have no complaints." Ryan held up his hands in surrender. I know. I'm just looking out for you, Michael. You know you can trust me. We're family." After Ryan left, Michael was left with the documents. That night, instead of just giving them a cursory glance, he read them line by line, and the more he read, the more questions arose. There were strange clauses, percentages that didn't make sense, names of companies he didn't recognize. Some of the investments mentioned didn't match what Ryan had previously explained. Michael spent the night reviewing old paperwork, contracts he had signed in recent years, bank statements that Ryan managed. And then he began to see a pattern, small discrepancies, figures that didn't add up, investments that theoretically made a profit, but whose returns never fully arrived. It was subtle, very well disguised, but it was there. His cousin, the one who always presented himself as the family's protector, as a reliable right-hand man, had been siphoning off funds for years. It wasn't huge amounts at once, which would have been obvious. It was percentages here and there, inflated fees, phantom investments. Over time, it added up to a fortune. Michael felt a mix of anger and disappointment. Anger at the theft, the betrayal. Disappointment for having been blind for so long. And worse, disappointment in himself for having suspected Helen, an honest woman who had never given him a reason to, while blindly trusting Ryan, who was robbing him right under his nose. The following Saturday, when Helen arrived, Michael was different. There was a new determination in his eyes, but also a sadness. He spent the day watching Helen work, no longer with suspicion, but with a kind of silent admiration. She continued to do everything with the same care as always. She looked after the children, organized the spaces, and maintained her unshakable integrity. During lunch, Michael did something unusual. He invited Helen to sit at the table with him, not just to supervise the children, but to share the meal as an equal. Helen hesitated, but accepted. They talked about trivial things, the weather, the news, the city's plans for the school holidays. Michael realized that Helen was intelligent, well-informed, and had well-founded opinions on various subjects. She just didn't share them because no one ever asked. After lunch, while the children were resting, Michael called Helen for a talk in his office. She entered with some apprehension, probably thinking she had done something wrong. Michael pointed to the chair in front of his desk. "Please, sit down. Helen, I need to apologize to you." She blinked, confused. "Apologize for what, Mr. Thompson?" "I tested you. Several times. The open safe, the extra money, the scattered documents. It was all intentional. I wanted to be sure I could trust you." Helen was silent for a moment, processing the information. Her face showed no anger, only a serene understanding. "I knew, Mr. Thompson. You knew." Not from the beginning, but after a few situations it became obvious. The open safe was too convenient. The extra money always happened at specific times. She gave a small smile. "I wasn't offended. I understand. You've been hurt before, you have reasons to be suspicious. But you never said anything, you never confronted me. Because it wasn't necessary. I knew my honesty would speak for itself eventually. And besides, Mr. Thompson, you didn't owe me your trust just because I work here. Trust is built over time, with consistent actions, not with words." Michael felt a lump in his throat. Here was a woman he had tested, watched and suspected, and yet she displayed an emotional maturity that he himself lacked. "I was so focused on protecting what's mine that I forgot to see who the real danger was." Helen tilted her head, curious. "What happened, Mr. Thompson?" He hesitated, but then decided to tell. He told her about Ryan, about the documents, about discovering the embezzlement. Helen listened attentively without interrupting. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment before speaking. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to confront him. I'm going to revoke all the authorizations he has. I'm going to get back what's mine, and I'm going to cut ties for good." "That's a difficult decision. He's family." Michael gave a bitter smile. "Family doesn't always mean loyalty, Helen. Sometimes strangers are more trustworthy than your own blood." She nodded. "Sometimes, but it's also important not to let the betrayals of a few stop us from trusting those who deserve it." Those words echoed in Michael's mind in the days that followed. He hired lawyers, auditors, and investigators. He compiled a complete dossier on Ryan's activities. The evidence was irrefutable. His cousin had embezzled significant amounts over 3 years, using the power of attorney Michael had given him after Patricia's death. The confrontation was set for a Tuesday at the law firm Michael had hired. Ryan arrived confidently, thinking it was just another routine meeting. When he saw the lawyers and the documents spread across the table, his expression changed. Michael was direct. "Ryan, I know everything. I know about the embezzlement, the fake investments, the inflated fees. I have all the proof right here." Ryan tried to deny it, then tried to downplay it, and finally tried to justify it. He claimed he was just protecting Michael's interests, that some financial decisions had to be made quickly. But the lies crumbled in the face of the evidence. Contracts signed without authorization, transfers to personal accounts, shell companies created in Michael's name, but controlled by Ryan. Michael's lawyer presented 2 options. Ryan could return everything he had stolen and sign a confession, keeping the matter out of court, or Michael would press criminal charges, which would result in years of litigation, public exposure, and likely prison time. Ryan, pale and defeated, chose the first option. He signed the restitution documents, renounced any involvement in the family businesses, and left that office a broken man. Michael felt no satisfaction, only a vast emptiness. Another person he had trusted had betrayed him. More proof that the world was exactly as he had always imagined, dangerous and full of lies. But then he thought of Helen. He thought of how she had remained upright even when tested repeatedly. He thought of Isabella handing him that drawing. He thought of Leo laughing genuinely for the first time in months, and he realized that maybe the world wasn't entirely bad. Maybe there were good people. Maybe he just needed to learn how to recognize them. The following Saturday, Michael waited for Helen to arrive. When she entered with Isabella, he was in the living room, not hidden in his office, watching through the cameras. He was there, present, visible. "Helen, "I'd like to talk to you about something important," he said. She nodded, and asked Isabella to go play with the toys in the living room. The girl obeyed, settling on the rug with her building blocks. Helen sat on the sofa, waiting. "I've resolved the situation with my cousin. I got back what was mine and cut ties for good." Michael paused. "And while I was doing that, I realized something. I realized I've spent years suspecting the wrong people and ignoring the signs from the right ones." Helen said nothing, just listened. "You showed me what true integrity is, not just with words but with consistent actions, day after day, situation after situation, and I was unfair to you. You weren't unfair, Mr. Thompson. You were protecting yourself and your son. It's understandable. Even so, I'd like to do something." Michael took a deep breath. "I'm doubling your salary. From now on, you'll receive twice what you're currently making. And if you need anything for Isabella, treatments, therapies, special materials, I want to help, not as a favor, but in recognition of your work and what you represent." Helen was visibly moved. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "Mr. Thompson, I don't know what to say. This will make a huge difference for us." "You don't have to say anything. Just keep being who you are." At that moment, Isabella looked up from her toys and did something extraordinary. She stood up, walked over to Michael, and spontaneously climbed into his lap. She said nothing, just settled in, hugging her teddy bear. Michael froze, unsure how to react. Helen smiled through her tears. "She doesn't do that with anyone," Helen murmured. "Only with people she trusts completely." Michael carefully wrapped his arms around the little girl, feeling her small weight against his chest. Something inside him finally broke. All the barriers he had built, all the walls of protection, crumbled in the face of that innocent and absolute trust. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel the affection, the bond, the possibility of something new. When Leo arrived that afternoon, he found a scene he never would have imagined. His father sitting on the sofa with Isabella in his lap, Helen beside them talking quietly, all together as if they were a family. Leo hesitated at the door, then smiled and ran to join them. The following months were a time of gradual transformation. The house ceased to be a silent mausoleum and became a home. Michael opened the curtains, allowing natural light to flood the rooms. He started having lunch with Helen and the children regularly. He began to actively participate in their games, not just as an observer, but as a participant. Helen changed too, not in her essence, which had always been solid, but in her openness. She began to share more about her life, about her dreams for Isabella, about her fears and hopes. Michael learned that she had lost her husband in a work accident years ago, shortly after Isabella was born. That she had raised her daughter alone ever since, facing every challenge without complaint, without asking for help, just moving forward with dignity. They developed a deep friendship based on mutual respect and understanding. There was no rush, no pressure, just a genuine connection growing naturally like a well-tended plant. Isabella blossomed in that environment. With access to better therapies, with a stable and loving routine, she began to communicate more. Still in her own unique way, but with more frequency and clarity. One day she called Michael something no one expected. She didn't say Dad. She didn't say Sir. She just said Mikey. It was her version of his name, and everyone understood it was an important milestone. Leo transformed as well. He became more responsible, more empathetic. Isabella's presence had taught him patience and understanding. He was no longer just a child visiting his father out of obligation. He was a boy building genuine memories of affection and belonging. It was on a night in September, as spring began to awaken New York, that Michael made a decision. He called Helen to talk in his office, the same place where months before he had tested her honesty. "Helen, I have her proposal for you," he began. "This house is too big for one person, and you two are already a part of it in a way that goes beyond work." He took a deep breath. "I would like you and Isabella to come live here permanently, not as an employee, but as family." Helen was silent, her eyes wide. "Mr. Thompson, I'm not sure I understand." You would have a permanent room, not the staff room. You would be part of the life of this house as members of it. Isabella would have everything she needs for her development. Leo would have the companionship that clearly does him good. And I would have something I thought I had lost forever, a family. Helen put a hand to her chest, emotional. That's very generous. But I need to think. I need to be sure it's the right thing for Isabella, for me, for everyone. Michael nodded. Of course, you don't have to answer now. Take your time. Talk to Isabella in your own way. And when you're ready, let me know. Helen stood up, but before she left, she turned to him. Mr. Thompson, thank you, not just for the offer, but for giving us the chance to be part of your life, for trusting us when it was so hard for you to trust anyone. Michael smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't given in years. Thank you, Helen, for showing me it's still worth believing in people. It took Helen 3 weeks to give him an answer. 3 weeks during which Michael respected her space, didn't pressure her, didn't mention the subject. They continued their weekend routine. But there was an expectation in the air, a silent tension that everyone felt but no one voiced. Leo asked a few times when Helen and Isabella were going to move in for real, and Michael would just reply that they had to wait, that important decisions couldn't be rushed. During this time, Helen talked at length with Isabella in her own way. She showed her pictures of the house, explained what the move would mean, and observed the girls' reactions. Isabella, with the peculiar wisdom of a child who sees the world differently, just pointed to Michael's picture and said, "Mikey good, house good." For her, it was that simple, and maybe it should be. Helen also thought about herself. She thought about the years of solitary struggle, the nights she cried in secret after paying bills that left her bank account empty, the times she refused help out of pride, out of fear of owing someone something. She thought about how she had built walls around her heart, not as high as Michael's, but walls nonetheless, and now she was faced with the possibility of tearing them down completely. It wasn't just about financial security. It was about belonging. It was about allowing Isabella to have a father figure, even if he wasn't her biological father. It was about accepting that sometimes family is chosen, not just inherited. And most importantly, it was about recognizing that Michael wasn't offering charity. He was offering a genuine connection, a real place in his life, not a favor. On the third Saturday, when Helen arrived, she asked to speak with Michael before Leo got there. They sat in the garden on the wooden bench under the crabapple tree that was blooming that spring. Isabella played nearby, chasing butterflies with the intense concentration she put into everything. "Mr. Thompson," Helen began, taking a deep breath, "I've thought a lot about your proposal. I talked with Isabella within her abilities. I've considered all the aspects, all the implications." Michael nodded, his heart racing, but he kept his expression serene. "And you've reached a conclusion?" "Yes." Helen looked directly into his eyes. "I accept. We accept. But on one condition." Michael blinked, surprised. "What condition?" "That this is real. That it's not just a convenient arrangement. That when there are problems, because there always are, we talk about them. That when Isabella has a meltdown, and she will, you don't regret it. That when I need to set boundaries because I will, you respect them. I want it to be real, Mr. Thompson, because if it's just a beautiful idea that will fall apart at the first sign of trouble, I'd rather stay as we are." Michael was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. Then he smiled, a smile full of respect and understanding. "Helen, I don't want a beautiful idea. I want mess, I want challenges, I want real life with all its imperfections. I spent years living in a perfect, lonely bubble. That's not living, it's just existing. I want to truly live with everything that entails, and I want you to be a part of it." Helen felt tears well up, but this time she didn't hold them back. She let them roll freely as she smiled. "Then it's settled. We'll need a few days to bring our things, organize the move." Michael shook his head. "I'll send a team to help with the move. And about your things, Helen, bring everything that's important. This house has plenty of space. Every photo, every object that has emotional value to you, I want it here. because I don't want you to feel like you're just occupying a room in someone's house. I want you to feel that this is your home too." At that moment, Isabella ran over, holding a butterfly that had landed on her hand. She carefully showed it to them, with that sparkle in her eyes that only children have when they discover something magical. Then, with all the delicacy in the world, she opened her hand and let the butterfly fly away. The three of them watched the insect drift away, dancing in the spring air, and Michael thought it was a perfect metaphor. Sometimes you had to open your hands, let go of control for beautiful things to happen. The move happened the following week. It wasn't just Helen and Isabella bringing suitcases. It was Michael personally helping to disassemble furniture in the rented apartment where they lived. It was discovering that Helen collected children's books, hundreds of them, carefully organized and catalogued. It was finding a photo album of Helen's late husband and her explaining to Isabella, with all sensitivity, that Daddy would always be in their hearts. But now they would have more people to love, and that was a good thing. It was Michael discovering that Isabella had a collection of colorful stones, each with a story only she understood. It was him having special shelves built in their new room, not the staff room, but a large suite on the second floor with a view of the garden and enough space for all of Isabella's treasures. It was Leo arriving in the middle of the move and shouting with joy when he found out they were staying forever. It was him helping to unpack boxes, assemble toys, and choose where everything should go. It was Claire showing up unexpectedly, and after the initial shock, hugging Helen and saying that Michael had finally found something she could never give him: true peace. In the following months, the house came alive in a way Michael had never imagined possible. The mornings were noisy, with Leo and Isabella fighting over the bathroom, with the smell of coffee and pancakes coming from the kitchen, where Helen insisted on making breakfast, even with Eunice available. The afternoons were unpredictable, with games that stretched across the garden, with music playing on the speakers, with laughter echoing through the halls. The evenings were the time Michael loved most. After dinner, they would gather in the living room. Sometimes they watched a movie, other times they just talked. Isabella would be on the rug drawing while Leo played video games. Helen would read or do crossword puzzles, and Michael would just watch it all, amazed at how completely his life had changed. Isabella still had her quirks. There were days when sensory stimuli were too much and she needed to stay in her room in the dark, just hugging her teddy bear. There were moments of frustration when she wanted to communicate something and couldn't, resulting in tears and agitation. But Michael learned to handle it. He learned to recognize the signs, to create safe spaces, to have infinite patience. One night, during one of these crises, it was Michael who stayed with Isabella while Helen rested. He held her in his lap, sang the same lullaby he had heard Helen sing months ago, and rocked her gently until she calmed down. When Helen came to check, she found them both asleep on the sofa, Isabella curled up against Michael's chest, completely relaxed. Helen took a picture of that moment and treasured it. Leo had his challenges too. Occasional jealousy of the attention Michael gave Isabella. Difficulty sharing the father who was once all his. But Helen talked to him, explained that love doesn't diminish when it's divided, it only multiplies. And slowly, Leo understood. More than that, he became protective of Isabella, a dedicated older brother who defended her at school when other children didn't understand her differences. It was in December, with Christmas approaching and New York decorated with lights, that something extraordinary happened. The family decided to put up the Christmas tree together, a tradition Michael hadn't celebrated since before Patricia's death. They went to a decoration store, a rare but necessary outing, and bought everything new. They didn't want relics of the past. They wanted to create new memories. On the night of the decorating, the living room was filled with boxes, ornaments scattered everywhere, and Christmas music playing. Leo and Isabella hung the colorful balls on the branches, not always neatly, but with genuine enthusiasm. Helen supervised, making sure the tree didn't topple over, and Michael, at the top of the ladder, placed the golden star on the highest point. When they finished, they turned off the living room lights and switched on just the tree lights. The soft glow illuminated everyone's faces, and Michael looked at the three people who had completely transformed his life. Helen, with her quiet strength and unshakable integrity. Leo, who finally had a home where he was truly happy. And Isabella, who had taught him that love doesn't need words to be profound. That night, before bed, Isabella did something no one expected. She had started to verbalize more in recent weeks, simple but meaningful words. When Michael went to say goodnight, she held his hand and said, clearly and distinctly, "Daddy Mikey." It wasn't just Mikey. It was Daddy Mikey. Michael felt the world stop. He looked at Helen, who was at the bedroom door with tears in her eyes. He knelt beside Isabella's bed and whispered, "Yes, my love, Daddy Mikey. And I always will be, I promise." Isabella smiled, hugged her teddy bear, and closed her eyes. Content. Michael left the room, reeling with emotion. In the hallway, he hugged Helen and cried for the first time in years. They weren't tears of sadness or loss. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of rebirth. In the following weeks, Michael began to plan something special for Isabella. He didn't want to just give her an expensive gift, something, material that any rich person could buy. He wanted something meaningful, something that showed he truly saw her, understood her, and loved her for who she was. He discovered, through conversations with Isabella's therapists, that the girl had a special fascination with aquariums. The way the fish moved, the colors, the controlled and predictable environment, all of it calmed and enchanted her. So Michael decided to turn an entire wall of Isabella's room into a built-in aquarium. He hired the best aquarists in New York, specialized designers, and marine biologists. The project took weeks. They created a complete ecosystem with tropical fish of all colors, aquatic plants, and special lighting that changed with the time of day. But the special touch was the inclusion of clownfish, Isabella's favorites, which she called Nemos. The reveal was planned for Christmas Eve. Michael asked Helen to keep Isabella busy while the team finished the installation. When everything was ready, he blindfolded the girl with a soft scarf and led her to her room. "Ready for your surprise?" he asked, crouching beside her. Isabella nodded eagerly. Michael removed the scarf and turned on the aquarium's special light. Isabella's reaction was everything he had hoped for, and more. Her jaw dropped, her huge eyes reflecting the vibrant colors of the fish. She slowly approached the glass wall, placed her hands on it, and stood there, completely mesmerized. "Nemo," she whispered. "Lots of Nemos. Yes, my love. They're all yours. They can stay here with you always." Isabella turned and hugged Michael with a strength he didn't know she had. "Thank you, Daddy Mikey. Best present ever." Helen watched from the doorway, her hands covering her mouth, trying to contain her emotion. Michael met her gaze and smiled. In that moment, he knew he had finally found what he had been searching for his whole life. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't professional success, it wasn't absolute control over everything. It was this. It was belonging. It was being needed, not for what he had, but for what he was able to give. Christmas arrived with a typical New York chill. The family gathered in the living room, this time including Claire and her husband, Eunice, and even some of Leo's friends from school. The table was laden with food, the house was decorated, and the atmosphere was filled with genuine joy. Michael observed it all with a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced. When it was time to exchange gifts, Leo opened a box to find the video game he wanted. Claire got a gift certificate for a spa she had always wanted to visit. Eunice received a trip to visit her family down south. And when it was Helen's turn, Michael handed her a simple envelope. Inside was a document. Helen read it once, then again, her eyes filling with tears. It was the deed to a small house in Isabella's name, an investment that would secure the girl's future no matter what happened. But, more importantly, it was Michael's acknowledgement that, although they all lived together now, he respected Helen's autonomy, her need to know she could care for her daughter on her own if necessary. "Michael, this is too much," she whispered. He shook his head. "It's not. It's the least I can do for the person who gave me my life back, who taught me to trust again, who showed me it's worth opening your heart even after being hurt so many times." They hugged for a long time while life continued around them. Leo and Isabella were already playing with their new toys. Claire was chatting animatedly with Eunice. The house was alive, noisy, imperfect, real. It was exactly as it should be. The following months brought a settled routine. It wasn't always perfect. There were arguments about boundaries, about responsibilities, about how to divide chores. There were difficult days when Isabella had more intense meltdowns. There were moments when Michael fell back into old patterns of distrust and needed Helen to remind him that not everyone had ulterior motives, but they were challenges they faced together, as a family. Helen wasn't just the nanny who had become part of the house. She was a companion, a partner in all important decisions. Michael learned to share not just his space, but the power of decision-making, the control he had once guarded for himself alone. It was on an ordinary afternoon in March, almost a year after the permanent move, that Michael realized something as he watched the garden. Isabella was teaching Leo how to identify different types of stones she collected. Helen was reading a book in the shade of the crabapple tree. The house smelled like the cake Eunice was baking for their afternoon snack. There was nothing extraordinary about the scene. It was just another day, but that's exactly what made it special. Because for years Michael had lived expecting catastrophes, prepared for betrayals, certain that nothing good would last. And now, here he was, living an ordinary day, surrounded by people who loved him, not for what he had but for who he was. He thought of Patricia, of how happy she would be to see him like this. He thought of Ryan, of how he had wasted years trusting the wrong person. He thought of all the times he had tested Helen, all the cameras he had installed, all the paranoia he had fed, and he realized that it wasn't his weakness, it was just unprocessed pain, unconfronted fear, unhealed scars. But scars do heal. They don't disappear, but they heal. And sometimes, unexpectedly, people come into our lives who help us in that healing process. People who ask for nothing, who demand nothing, who are just genuine in their essence. Helen was that person for Michael, and Isabella, with her innocence and authenticity, was living proof that the purest love doesn't need elaborate words. Sometimes all it takes is a nickname, a spontaneous hug, a small, hand-holding yours with absolute trust. That night, during dinner, Michael made an announcement. "I'd like to make a toast." He raised his glass of juice because Isabella was at the table and they didn't drink alcohol in front of her. "I want to toast to this family we've built, not by genetics, not by obligation, but by choice, by true love, by earned trust, to all the imperfect days yet to come, because they will be infinitely better than the perfect empty days I lived before." Everyone raised their glasses. Leo shouted an excited cheers. Isabella clapped her hands, in her own way. Helen smiled with that serene smile Michael had grown to love, and Eunice, who had witnessed the entire transformation, discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. After dinner, when the children were asleep and the house finally fell silent, Michael and Helen stood on the patio, watching the city lights in the distance. The air was cool, a gentle breeze heralding the approach of fall. "Do you have any regrets?" Michael asked suddenly. "About accepting to come here, about changing your whole life?" Helen thought for a moment before answering. "I don't have regrets, but I won't lie and say I wasn't scared. I was terrified. Scared I was making the wrong decision. Scared Isabella would get too attached and then get hurt. Scared of losing my independence. But you know what I realized, Michael?" She looked at him. "Fear will always be there. The question is whether we let fear decide for us, or if we decide in spite of the fear." Wise words. They're the words of someone who has lost a lot and learned that standing still for fear of losing more is just another way of losing. It's losing opportunities, losing connections, losing life as it passes by. Michael nodded, absorbing that truth, and I, who spent years thinking I was protecting myself, was only imprisoning myself. "But you broke out of prison, and you brought us with you. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything." They stood in comfortable silence, just existing side by side. They didn't need to fill every second with words. They had learned that shared silences could be as meaningful as deep conversations. Inside, Isabella slept, hugging her teddy bear, surrounded by colorful fish swimming gently in her private aquarium. Leo dreamed of adventures he would have the next day. Eunice reviewed the grocery list for the week, and somewhere in the city, Ryan dealt with the consequences of his choices, while Michael chose not to think about him anymore, because resentment is also a prison. And Michael was tired of prisons. He was tired of walls, of surveillance cameras, of elaborate tests. He was tired of living in fear. He just wanted to live. And he was living, finally, truly living. The following years brought more changes. Leo became a responsible teenager, dividing his time between his mother's house and his father's, but always eager to come back and see Isabella. The girl continued to progress in her therapies, developing new ways to communicate, surprising everyone with her capacity for resilience. Helen became not just part of the family, but an essential presence in Michael's life. Not romantically, at least not in a traditional sense. It was something deeper than that. It was true partnership, mutual respect, sincere admiration. It was knowing they could count on each other always, without conditions, without reservations. And Michael, the man who once lived as a recluse in his own home, became someone different. He didn't completely abandon his cautious nature. He was still careful about who he let into his life, but he learned the difference between healthy caution and destructive paranoia. He learned to give chances. He learned that trusting is always a risk, but it's a risk worth taking. Because in the end, as Helen had taught him, living in fear of being hurt isn't living. It's just surviving. And he was tired of just surviving. On a Sunday morning, 5 years after that first test with the safe, Michael woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the garden. He looked out the window and saw Isabella, now 10, teaching Leo, almost a teenager, how to identify constellations using an app on his phone. Helen was setting up a picnic under the crabapple tree, which was now heavy with fruit. He went down and joined them, not as a distant observer, but as an active participant in the life they had built together. He helped spread the blanket on the lawn, served juice, and listened as Isabella excitedly explained about the stars, even though it was daytime and they couldn't see them. And there, sitting in that garden, that was once just an empty space in an empty house, surrounded by people who chose to love him and whom he chose to love back. Michael Thompson finally understood what Patricia had always tried to teach him, that the best things in life can't be locked in safes, can't be protected by walls, can't be controlled by security cameras. The best things in life need freedom to flourish. They need trust to grow. They need courage to exist. And most importantly, they need to be chosen every day, consciously, deliberately, with all the risk and all the beauty that implies. He looked at Helen, who was smiling as she cut fruit. He looked at Isabella, who was gesturing animatedly as she explained about the moon. He looked at Leo, who was listening with genuine attention. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was finally home. Not in the physical house, that enormous mansion on the Upper East Side, but home in the deepest sense of the word. In the place where he was completely accepted. In the place where he could be vulnerable without fear. In the place where love had no price, no conditions, no contracts. And it had all started with a woman who simply refused to steal from an open safe. A woman who proved day after day that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in who you are. A woman who, without knowing it, saved a man who was drowning in his own suspicion. Sometimes Michael thought as he bit into a strawberry that Helen had just cut, sometimes people come into our lives without making a sound, without demanding anything, without promising everything. They just arrive. They are who they are, they do what they do, and suddenly when we look back we realize that nothing is the same as it was before. And that, he finally understood, was not a threat. It was a blessing. End of story. Hey everyone, we hope the story of Michael, Helen and Isabella touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of suspicion transformed into love, of walls torn down and families built by choice, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Was it the test with the safe? Isabella's spontaneous hug? The moment she called Michael Daddy Mikey? Or perhaps the quiet transformation of a man who learned that trusting, even when it's risky, is the only true way to live? Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, showing that even in the most wounded hearts, love can bloom again. We'll see you in the next episode, with another story that will make you reflect on your own choices, your own fears, and your own possibilities for a new beginning. See you soon.